Hey, Mike.
That's Donnel.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah.
I met Donnel at the Aspen Ideas Climate Gathering. The event brings together scientists, innovators, and corporate leaders to find solutions to our climate crisis.
Donnel, for anyone who wants to talk about your present, they have to know something about your past. Can you tell us your childhood story and how that perhaps changed the trajectory of your life?
Yeah, well, glad to be here. One of the most interesting things about my childhood is when my parents moved from Guyana in South America to Brooklyn. They moved into an apartment building that didn't have a working heating system. And so even when it would be freezing cold during the winters, we didn't have heat. And so we and all of our neighbors used our gas oven to heat our apartment at night. And we would turn on the gas, open up the oven door, and then open up a window to release the toxic chemicals to the outside world. And so pretty early on, I was introduced to the intersection of kind of energy poverty and health, and the need to manage the relationship between those two things. And so,
and those two words, energy poverty, we don't hear them very often, but it's out there, right?
It's out there, and I mean, you all talk to a global audience. I've had the chance to travel in India and Istanbul and Brazil, and energy poverty is a real thing. And one of the things that our generation has to figure out is there's going to be hundreds of millions of people around the world who are going to need energy for their families, to purify water, for heating, for air conditioning, all over the world. Middle class in China, emerging middle class in India. As people move from energy poverty to having energy access, what does that mean for climate change? And how do we navigate that transition in a way that's equitable and fair for everybody?
Donnel's startup, Block Power, upgrades buildings so that they are greener and cleaner for the environment. Previously, he was the voter contact director for the Obama for America campaign. He also managed a national project that used financing from the U.S. Department of Energy to create green construction jobs for out-of-work populations.
Block Power, how did it come about, and how do you get an idea like that? Because it's fantastic, and you can explain it to people, but I mean, to me, that's one of the things that's really fantastic about it is this is such a great idea, and combining all the elements of it. How did it come to you?
Well, we started developing Block Power as part of a process. I actually was a senior staffer for Barack Obama's presidential campaign, his first one. And I didn't think he was going to win, but he won. And when he did, they said that I could move to DC and do that whole thing, but I didn't want to. I'd met my wife, and she was in New York, so I wanted to be in New York. And so they offered me an opportunity to create green jobs, which is something that I've been focused on from when I graduated from college, was focused on economic empowerment for financially underserved communities, and was focused on climate change, which I'd learned about in college, and wanted to work at that intersection of creating jobs for low-income families to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that was my thing. And so they offered me a role as a consultant to the U.S. Department of Energy to supervise the green buildings component of the 2009 Obama-Biden stimulus, where we invested $6.5 billion in trying to green buildings across America. And some of it worked, and some of it didn't. And 12 years later, here I am still trying to make greening buildings across America work. So I was introduced to the industry and the challenges and opportunities of greening buildings at that time. And after thinking about the problem for about a decade, we came up with the idea of turning buildings into Teslas, which is what we do. That just like Tesla rips out the fossil fuel engine out of automobiles and replaces it with a smart, modern, all-electric engine, we can now rip out fossil fuel heating, cooling, cooking equipment out of buildings and replace it with all-electric, green, healthy, smart, modern electric equipment. So we can do that for buildings all over across America. We can do it for buildings all over the world. That will reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by over 30%.
The interesting thing, though, is the first car I ever drove was a 1970 Maverick, which I'm sure is somewhere rotting right now. Elon Musk is not tasked with turning that 1970 Maverick into a Tesla, but you sort of are. You're taking some of these buildings that are maybe even Ramblers or Model Ts and turning them into Teslas. That's no small task, is it?
It's a great analogy. It's really apt, and it's not a small task. If we're smart about it, if you think through, to stick with your analogy, all right, well, you got a Model T or a Rambler or a Dodge Dart. What sized engine does each of those types of cars need? What size electric engine makes sense for each of those cars? And what kind of installation processes would you need to train workers on in order to rehab those vehicles so that you can convert them to all electric? That's what we do for buildings. And we've been really fortunate that Jeff Bezos gave us a climate philanthropy grant to build a software tool that allows us to scrape data on 125 million buildings across America so that we can identify the type of building that each of these buildings is, and assign and decide and analyze what kind of all electric equipment makes sense for each building's type. So whether you're in an apartment building or a church or a synagogue or a mosque or a school or a ranch style home or a Victorian single family home, we can figure out by the age and type of your building what kind of decarbonization and all electric equipment is appropriate and makes sense for your building. So that's what my company does. And then if you need to borrow some money to do the project, then we'll lend you the capital as well.
Some neighborhoods within an urban area become much warmer than their surroundings due to absorbing and re-emitting the sun's heat. Green rooftops can be an effective solution to urban heat islands. A rooftop walk across Rotterdam hopes to show the future of the city. Green rooftops can take many shapes: lush gardens, solar panels, urban farms, and community spaces painted in light colors that absorb less sunlight. This can help combat heat islands inside the cities.
You know what's interesting about your world, though? It seems like you have one foot in the real world because you're going to some of these underserved communities that really need help. And then one foot in the dream world where you go out to the Silicon Valley to raise money, and these are like the big dreamers, and they're creating, these high-tech companies and making tons and tons of money. Can you talk about navigating both? Because that's got to be a really interesting perspective. One day you're here and you're just seeing, income inequality, and then you're going and you're seeing income inequality on another level.
There are moments where I'm in Menlo Park in Silicon Valley. I remember I was at some barbecue and I turned around and there was Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, and then to my right was Peter Thiel and then Kim Kardashian and Kanye. It was just, you are in these crazy dream world environments in big tech. And sometimes you are at the top of Mount Olympus. We have some of the best investors in the world. We're really proud of that. We're proud that they support our vision. They invest in things like Facebook and Uber and Twitter and Lyft, and they invest in us so that we can figure out how to marry this world of atoms with their world of bits, right? Because we work in the physical world. How do you go into low income or financially underserved communities that have things like mold and lead and asbestos in the basements surrounding 100-year-old heating systems that burn oil or gas, right? And so the question is, what are the ways that we can use software in the world of bits to model and simulate the kinds of decarbonization and electrification work that we do to make buildings smarter, healthier, greener, safer for all? And how do you use software to solve these real world construction problems in the world of atoms? And so I do have to go from the top of Mount Olympus in Silicon Valley to like the basement of a low income apartment building and put my construction hat on and curse at the site manager to make sure that the project goes well. And so I think not only for me, but for everyone on the Block Power team, our ability to navigate both worlds, and oh, by the way, to stop at Goldman Sachs on Wall Street and ask them for capital so that we can finance our projects, to go from Silicon Valley to Wall Street, to local low-income communities. We look for staff that can figure out how to navigate those complexities.
And putting on that construction hat and going down there and knowing that you're helping people in these communities, that has to give you the fuel to go, every 3 weeks out to the Silicon Valley and knock on doors and say, hey, we need some more capital, right?
Absolutely. We've been really excited about a new project we have with Mayor Eric Adams in New York City, where we've hired and trained 800 adults from the highest crime communities in New York City, communities that have really high rates of gun violence. And the NYPD and the district attorney, they have statistical models that identify individuals that are likely to be involved in future incidents of gun violence based on their record. And we were asked to train and hire those people and employ them in our clean energy projects in New York City. So we've done that for the last 6 months. We've trained and hired hundreds and hundreds of folks from hundreds and hundreds of New York families that are low income. And there's been some amazing stories, someone who was in foster care their entire life, who now has a full-time job at a tech company, someone who was locked up, incarcerated for 17 years, who was reunited with their kids and now has a full-time job installing solar panels. We trained and hired a team of people who'd been incarcerated in Rikers Island, which is the jail in New York City. And we sent them out to Rikers Island and they put in solar panels on the island, right? And they said, well, the last time I was here, I was locked up myself, or I came to visit my parents who were locked up. But now they're here to do something positive and put clean energy onto Rikers Island and generate clean electricity for surrounding communities and get paid while doing it. So that kind of work does give us a lot of motivation and makes it easier to navigate the challenges of raising capital in Silicon Valley.
A vast array of solar panels floats on the shimmering waters of a reservoir in northeast Thailand, symbolizing their efforts towards carbon neutrality by 2050. The immense installation, covering 720,000 square meters of water surface, is a hybrid system that converts sunlight to electricity by day and generates hydropower at night.
Going into these communities, it has to bring back memories of your own childhood. So what's it like to go in there and to help people who are in these communities, give them jobs? I mean, what's that feeling like?
It's a really great feeling of satisfaction and completion. Every time we complete a project, there's so much happiness on the face of the decision makers in the home, the parents, the grandparents, because the systems actually are really comfortable. And so they actually increase the comfort of homes in addition to reducing cost and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and saving money. And so people are always really excited. And that's part of what keeps me going and gets me up in the morning and gets me to leave my beautiful new newborn baby and go out into the field, because we know that we're helping so many people. Really excited about it.
In France, this coal power plant in Saint-Avold stopped burning fossil fuels after almost 2 centuries of operation. The power plant will be converted into biomass and a green hydrogen production site. The change should save some of the 87 jobs on site, and the operation should begin in 2024.
The first chief scientist with Apple said the best way to predict the future is to invent it, but it's also, you have to invest in it. Have there been hurdles for you going out and trying to convince people this is the road forward? And talk about sustainability, because there's going to be a lot of talk about climate change here, but sustainability is key moving forward. I mean, it's not just the vision of what a city looks like today, it's how that city looks for your children, as they grow up, and for our future.
Unfortunately, women and people of color only raise 3% of the total capital that's invested from Silicon Valley. And so, 97% of the money goes to the same old profile of folks, which is a challenge for me as an entrepreneur of color that needs to raise capital from Silicon Valley, but also a challenge, I think, for the human race. If you believe, as I do, that talent and genius is evenly distributed throughout the human population, then we need to be investing in the best innovators from every class, from every community, from every gender, from every color. And we're not doing that right now. So we were subject to these challenges when we raised capital. We've been very fortunate to partner with some of the best investors in the world, Capor Capital, who invested in Uber, Andreessen Horowitz, who invested in Twitter and Airbnb and Lyft, and Goldman Sachs and Microsoft and Salesforce and AmFam. So in some ways we got lucky. In some ways we were able to persevere to find like-minded investors who were concerned about their kids and grandkids and wanted to find ways to work with us to bring our solutions and bring the future that we see to reality. And that future is about the long-term sustainability. We can decarbonize transportation. We can decarbonize real estate. We can decarbonize agriculture. We can do those things now. We don't need to invent a whole bunch of new technology. There are places where we will need to invent technology where we scrape, carbon from the sky and find economic uses for it. And so we will have to invent those things. But there's a lot of things that we can do right now. And so decarbonizing buildings is one of those things that we can do right now. We don't need new technology. We've already invented everything that we need. And so since we can do it, we should do it.
I want to talk to you about sustainability, what it means to you, but also the frustration factor that so much of what we see out there in the news is just kind of these ancillary things. But these are key issues that all of us are facing around the globe, and it seems like you have to squeeze in there to get on the agenda in terms of news coverage. How frustrating is it for you, and what are your thoughts on that? And talk a little bit about sustainability and why it's important to chat about it.
It's frustrating. I also find it terrifying. I mean, as a parent of young children, we just had a newborn a few weeks ago. We find what's happening with climate change terrifying. We find the difficulties that you all may run into leading a public conversation around it horrifying. We find the loggerheads and inactivity of the United States Senate, who are trying but struggling to reach a resolution on a national climate agreement so that the United States can help to lead the world on climate and sustainability. These things are frustrating and terrifying. So I would say that I am afraid. I do have the great privilege of being able to lead a company that has a plan to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 30% over the next 7 to 15 years. And it's a credible plan that scientists back. And what it allows us to do is actually transition to longer term sustainability, not to think about one-off behavior modifications or interventions, but to think about what does it look like to redesign our economy so that it is more sustainable. Environmentally, socially, psychologically. What does it look like to think through redesigning our economy, and what does it look like to implement the redesign of our economy while the economy still functions? So I think we're past the point of, having theoretical conversations around, well, what if we did this and what if we do that? We need to put best practices in place and test things out and see what works. We need to make our case to consumers that sustainability is better, not just because it's ethical, not just because we want to save the planet, but because it's healthier. It's healthier for you and your kids to decarbonize your home. Why? Well, you may have a gas oven or know someone who does. If you think about your favorite meal, your family holiday meal, where you may have folks who are cooking your favorite meal in the oven. Well, while they're cooking that favorite meal, methane and nitrogen dioxide is being released into your home, and everyone's breathing that in, and all of your kids and your nieces and nephews and newborns are breathing that in, and that is why the asthma rates of chronic childhood asthma in America have spiked. And as China and India and other countries move hundreds of millions of people into the middle class, the public health impacts of burning dead plants and animals, fossil fuels, in our homes to cook and provide heating and air conditioning and hot water, the health impacts of that are disastrous. And so sustainability is not just something that we do to feel good about, to feel moral, to feel like we're preserving the future the planet for future generations. It's better for our health and our longevity and our families. And I think what we're starting to think about is how do you start to tell that story in a way that's more immediate. Certainly any parent that learns that their fossil fuel gas oven is poisoning their kids is going to think twice about, like, well, maybe I can electrify and move to an electric stove, for example, and decarbonize the way that you cook in your kitchen. And so changing and shifting to more sustainable practices is paramount. But as an entrepreneur, we have to make the case to consumers in a way that's compelling and immediate to them so that sustainability is a high priority.
I think you just did it, so we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Donnel. It's been a pleasure.
It's good to be here. It's nice to be with you. Yeah.